The cerebrum. Let's go ahead and talk about the part that y'all probably are a little bit more familiar with than that of the brainstem, diencephalon, etc., etc. Now, first off, I want to talk about some of the landmarks, some of the descriptions of the morphology of the lobes. Let's talk first about the gyrus. Gyrus is that just a little bit of a chunk that's bulging out. Brain's been described as being folded up paper. The paper that you can see that's visualized, that's been folded out, is that gyrus. You got two principal gyrus that you want to remember for later on in this discussion. We'll talk about those later, though, are the post and precentral gyrus. Another one that you're going to care about, or a landmark that you want to care about, is a sulcus. A sulcus is that indentation into your cerebral hemispheres. Finally, you have something called a fissure, which is very much less prevalent. In fact, you can count how many fissures are in your brain on one hand. A fissure is just a lot deeper than that of a sulcus. One example of a fissure is this longitudinal fissure that divides the two cerebral hemispheres. Here is what it looks like. You can literally pull that fissure apart and look deep inside. Well, if you look at the sulcus right here, it's not very deep in comparison. That again is the longitudinal fissure, the guy that separates the two hemispheres of the brain. So deep into the cortex, you're going to see a lot of white matter, and it's composed of tracts. Tracts, some of you are going, okay, that doesn't sound familiar. Let's just take a quick look at it. This is a tract. A tract is just your axons in the central nervous system, a group of those axons. You will never, ever, ever call these tracts a nerve. A nerve is the group of axons in the peripheral nervous system. Tracts that we talk about in the central nervous system, aka inside your spinal cord and inside your brain, those axons are called tracts. A principal bridge of tracts is called between the two hemispheres is called the corpus callosum. It allows the interaction of the two hemispheres and the coordination of their efforts. Without it, you see some poor coordination. Even though you have that cerebellum and those decussation of pyramids trying to do their best, it's still going to have that issue. If that corpus callosum is gone, you're going to see some lack of coordination, some inability to mentally process things or do things on their own, kind of like Rain Man. With that, let's go ahead and talk about the lobes of the cerebrum. These should be pretty darn familiar if you have studied the bones of the skull already. You have a frontal lobe, you have yourself a parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and the one that might not be so familiar is your insula. Insula is on the inside, if that helps. Insula inside. Now, how you can hopefully remember this if you've learned your cranial bones. If you look at your frontal lobe, guess where it's underneath? Your frontal bone. Your parietal lobe, guess what? It's underneath your parietal bone. Your occipital lobe, guess what? It's underneath your occipital bone. And what do you know? There it is, temporal lobe underneath your temporal bone. I just love it when they do that. That makes life so much easier. Now, how do we know where one lobe begins and one lobe ends? Well, not only functionality, but also there are some landmarks that you're going to care about. The very first one is this one right here. It is your central sulcus. It is the one that divides the parietal and the frontal lobe. It is a very important sulcus. It has a lot to do with identifying your sensory and your motor portions of your brain. And I did mention beforehand that there was a precentral gyrus and a postcentral gyrus. That's because it is a gyrus. The precentral gyrus is right before that central sulcus. And I bet you can guess why it's called the postcentral gyrus. Well, it's because it is behind that central sulcus. Another landmark that divides the frontal lobe from the temporal and parietal lobe quite nicely is this lateral cerebral sulcus. It's kind of deep. It almost could have been called a fissure, but not quite. It is your lateral cervical sulcus. It is dividing away from your frontal lobe from that of your parietal lobe. Forgive me, your frontal lobe from that of your temporal lobe. Now, this name that divides the parietal and occipital lobes, I thank the people that decided to name it this, is the parietal occipital lobe, or sulcus. It is that sulcus that is dividing the parietal, occipital lobe. Yay! I love it. Now that we have that divisions down, we have those main landmarks of the central sulcus and all that stuff, we can start dividing up some of their functionality. Let's start off here in the parietal. I want you to notice in this area that it has a lot of the somatosensory association areas, or the primary somatosensory area, the touch, the feel, the pain, and all that good stuff, and stretching. So somato means body, sensory means, well, the sense. We're going to go ahead and go clockwise, and we're going to go over into the frontal lobe. You'll notice that it has a lot to do with motor. There's a large chunk of the motor area here, as well as the prefrontal cortex, which is who you are, your memory, your information, your not quite memory, but your data, your complex thought. That's the word I'm looking for, your complex thought. Carrying on with that clockwise faction, we are going to talk about the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe has a lot of those auditory areas, as well as that olfaction area. Deep inside, since we're already there, let's talk insula. Insula is your gustatory. Gustatory just refers to taste. So how I remember gustatory being taste, when you're eating some Italian food and you really like it, you're eating it with con gusto, with great like. Gusto or gusta means to like or please you. So when you eat, you are being well pleased. Finally, we are on to the occipital area with your visual association area. So occipital, optical. Occipital sounds like optical. If you're to reorganize those letters, optical often refers to your visual area. Hopefully that helps you remember that. Now, two areas that I hope that you must, I shouldn't say hope, you must remember are your Broca's speech area and your Waring's language area. The Broca's area is where you are able to notice where it is located. It is in that premotor area. This suggests that the Broca's area has control over something that moves. And if we are talking about speech, guess what? It's probably going to be talking about your tongue, your ability to communicate. If your Broca's area is damaged, what you are not able to speak to a degree. And if it's completely damaged, it's very difficult or not at all able to speak. The Waring's area, I want you to notice, is in the parietal zone. It is also a piece of it is in the temporal zone. Parietal zone has a lot to do with sensory. If this helps you remember it, a lot of the things that you say, you can speak, you can make words, you can form words, but those words don't make sense. So for instance, you could say a phrase of, I'm glad Penguin is eating nails. And what they're really trying to say is, please pass the salt. Now, if this area inside the temporal lobe is messed up as well, they might be able to speak, but they don't understand what's going on. So that Waring's area is the sensory portion, so it's in that parietal, while the Broca's is in the motor portion, which is the speaking and using your tongue portion. Hopefully that helps you remember where the Broca's area is, as well as what does the frontal lobe and the precentral sulcus does, because it's all motor. while the larynx is in the parietal, that sensory, that comprehension. Basal nuclei of the cerebrum, they are just bits and pieces of gray matter inside your cerebral hemispheres. They're paired often and frequently. We're not going to talk too much about that. In fact, this is about all we're talking about. We are going to talk about the limbic system, however. This is bits and pieces both reside inside the cerebrum and the diencephalon. Remember the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. I'm going to go ahead and hit about 4 structures here. First off, starting off at the amygdala. This is what the Colonel Sanders of Waterboy should have pointed out. This is the amygdala. It is your fear and aggression. If somebody has the amygdala damaged, they do not sense that fear that they in other people's faces. They have a difficult time understanding and comprehending fear. This stria terminalis is a nuclei inside your limbic system. This is where you get your pleasure and satisfaction, or you interpret that pleasure and satisfaction. And the memory, you got all 4 of these doing something with it, but we're going to focus on the hippocampus itself. It is like the computer processor of memory. It is the place that you want to try and access something. It's going to pull all that data from the different hemispheres and put it all together. That's why it's so important if you want to remember something, or you want to remember an especially important part of your life or event in your life, you're going to try and remember everything about it. What did it feel like? Was it light? Was it dark? Was it cold? Was it warm? Was the thing that you're touching hard or soft? Was there a lot of noise? Was it quiet? All that wonderfulness. So, summary, you'd have sensory areas, you got motor areas, and you got the association areas that help combine everything together. And a couple more quick things. The hemispheric lateralization. Some of you have probably heard, hey, I must be a left hemisphere person because you like numbers a lot and you like to reason and I like to learn languages and all that stuff. Well, some of them are like, no, I'm more of a right hemisphere type of person. I like to draw, I like to paint, all that wonderfulness. Well, yes and no. That I see where you're coming from. Everyone has these bits and pieces in their brain. Just because if you like art and stuff, it doesn't mean that the portion of your brain that likes numerical and scientific stuff is like dramatically smaller. It just depends on preference, depends on how you are. Something to also remember is that the left hemisphere, the Broca's area, remember Broca's is the speech, is if it gets affected on the left side, that is where you can't really understand or speak the written or spoken language. But if that same area of the Broca's area in the right hemisphere is mangled or damaged, you start speaking in a monotone voice, and everything doesn't really have any emotional inflections or anything like that. A lot of things are missing, and you can't really understand people's Yeah, it's a little different. Sounds like I might have had a transient ischemic stroke there in my right hemisphere. Maybe I should go ahead and check that out. Finally, brainwaves. Brainwaves is just a really fancy way of saying that a lot of neurons are firing off at the same time. The frequency at what they fire off determines what they're called, if they're alpha, beta, theta, or delta. Alpha, beta, theta, delta are just Greek letters or letters in the Greek alphabet, and they aren't in order of the highest frequency to lowest frequency. If we were going to do that, it would look like this. Beta would be on top, followed by alpha, theta, and delta. If you were to hook somebody up to a bunch of electrodes to see what type of electrical stimuli is going on inside their brain, you would see the beta waves during them being awake and moving and functioning and operating, grabbing that pencil, moving it around, and having some type of sensory. Alpha waves you'd see more along the lines of probably what some of you are doing right now. And you're just closing your eyes, you're just sitting there listening, trying just to take a mental break. While even a couple more of you might be doing the theta waves, sleeping. Finally, hopefully none of you are currently experiencing this, the delta waves, that is brain damage. Although there are some people out in this world, I wonder if they have brain damage, even though they are functioning adults. You, by the way, if you get your baby tested on their brain waves and you see delta waves, don't go, "Oh no, my baby's got brain damage." No, not so much. Babies and infants, newborns, they have those delta waves. You're going to see a lot of stuff when you get into pediatrics and all that stuff, where babies' responses are considered normal. But if you were to see baby responses in adults, like neurological responses in adults, like Babinski signs, then we've got uh-ohs. With that, that is the last bit about the cerebrum and all of its goodness. We are going to go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and create this presentation of your cranial nerves, and we will see you shortly.